Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I wanted to talk about the current escalation of tensions in Iran, as well as what is going on in Syria regarding the Kurds and the possible peace deal that has now been reached. So without further ado, let's get in. Tensions between the United States and Iran are escalating rapidly. The USS Abraham Lincoln has now reached the Gulf waters, and it is currently navigating between the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman. I believe that with all the military posturing, all the fortifying of the United States bases within the Gulf region, the arrival of the USS Abraham Lincoln, I think Donald Trump has now dispatched a second carrier to the region as well. But primarily, I think that all measures that could possibly be taken to launch an attack on Iran are now in place. And I believe that the Americans are ready to act on that. Now, while this may be the case, you have Turkey that has decided to flex its diplomatic muscle. Turkey feels best suited to conduct these negotiations and go and play the mediator between the United States and Iran because of primarily two reasons. Firstly, it claims it shares this massive border with Iran, which then allows it to have some influence over the Iranian regime by way of mediating. And secondly, it's a NATO member. So Turkey says that it has access to the ears of other NATO members as well as the United States.
As fears of another conflict loom, Turkey says it's time for conversation, not confrontation. And in Istanbul, President Erdogan and Foreign Minister Fidan offered to be the bridge to make that happen.
So basically it's saying, the Turkish government are saying they have an inside channel to both Iran and the West, and that is why they feel that they are best suited to navigate or to mediate between these two powers. Now, let's bear in mind that the Turkish government has never mediated in any conflict without having any ulterior motives. So one has to question Erdogan's enthusiasm for wanting to be involved in this, because you know that he's the type of person that while he's mediating a truce between the United States and Iran, he's subsequently capable of negotiating a deal with Iran where they inflict some sort of damage to the United States and simultaneously engage himself in conversation with the United States where they also inflict some sort of harm and damage on Iran, which in both scenarios would end up beneficial to his regime. I find that Turkey's insistence on wanting to play mediator in this matter is really fascinating, given the fact that when the Iranian uprising that recently took place in all the major cities in Iran, and a group of Kurdish fighters that were poised to cross the border into Iran, Erdogan's government tipped off the Iranians about this incursion, and this led to the apprehension of those Kurdish forces. There were PKK militants coming in from the north of Iran. Now, despite tensions between Turkey and Iran, the Kurds are seen as both enemies of the Turks as well as the Iranians. So in this instance, Erdogan is comfortable working with the Iranians against the Kurds. Now let's not forget that in late 2025, Erdogan hailed the signing of a ceasefire between the PKK and the Turkish government, and that the PKK had then committed to lay down their arms and involve themselves in political dialogue with the Turkish regime. The Turks are afraid that Iran becoming destabilized and the Kurds gaining an influence within some part of Iran, it would prove disastrous to them. Now, all this is happening at a very interesting time because the United States, who was a benefactor of the Kurdish rebels in Syria, has now withdrawn support for them. During the insurgency against Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, the US actively supported the Kurds against the Assad regime. And the Kurds were primarily funded by the Americans, and they had formed the Syrian Defense Force, which had controlled large swaths of area in the northeast of Syria. They controlled the oil fields in Deir ez-Zor, and they also controlled the wheat production. So this helped the American sanctions become even more crippling on the Syrian people because the food supply and the oil supply was now severely restricted. There's also been talk of the oil that was controlled by the Kurds in the northeast having been shipped out of Syria to Turkey. And there's no prizes for guessing who was involved in this. The Russians had accused the Turks of helping logistically with the transport of this stolen oil out of Syria, which apparently was then repackaged and sold on to Israel. And the trucks that were used to transport the oil out of Syria belonged to none other than Erdogan's son, Bilal Erdogan, and Erdogan's son-in-law, Berat Albayrak, who incidentally was the former Turkish energy minister. Now, it's common knowledge that ISIS in Syria was controlled by Erdogan, because when the Russians were about to eliminate the last remnants of ISIS within Syria, when they stepped in to help Bashar al-Assad regain control of his country, Erdogan provided security guarantees to the Russians that he would herd these ISIS fighters into a zone and keep them there. Once again, everybody now knows that Erdogan's guarantees are not even worth the paper that they printed on. Because when the Bashar regime fell, Jolani and his band of merry men had marched in literally unopposed into Damascus. And Erdogan had hailed this as a victory. You find that the United States withdrawing its support for the Kurds in Syria and realigning with the Syrian government now headed by Jolani caused the collapse of Kurdish opposition to the government, to the current Syrian government. And this resulted in a lot of PKK and Peshmerga forces being massacred. There's rumors of ISIS having scalped the females, in the Peshmerga forces when they encountered them. Kurds had helped contain these ISIS fighters in prisons. There were rumors that some of them had broken out, and there's no guess as to where they're going to head now. So all I can say is watch Europe, watch the United Kingdom, because these fighters are going to be making their way back into Europe. And the cycle begins again. Remember when Angela Merkel opened the doors to Syrian refugees and nobody knew exactly who was coming in? What subsequently happened in Europe then? The spate of bombings, attacks, those types of things? Be prepared. The US is also reported to be moving 7,000 ISIS prisoners, and these are highly undesirable ISIS prisoners. These are people who are, the worst of the worst that ISIS has to offer. These men are now being reported to be moved by the Americans into a safe, for want of a better word, prison in Iraq. But if you sit back and you analyze it, you understand that the movement of these prisoners from Syria to Iraq means that when the attack on Iraq does come to fruition, these 7,000 plus prisoners, ISIS prisoners, will be let loose to go and help the Americans achieve their aim in Syria, which means that the United States doesn't have to put boots on the ground. They'll use the Iranian populace, they'll use these ISIS fighters to go in and do their jobs. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu has warned of this movement of these ISIS terrorists and the escape of these ISIS terrorists because he knows that it's going to be a disaster for the West. Other developments also signal to an imminent United States attack on Iran. Notably, that the EU has now decided and approved the naming of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Now, if you remember, Donald Trump's administration pushed for the same thing with the Mexican drug cartels, because once you have them branded as terrorists, they legally become legitimate targets. So the US can go into Mexico, take out these cartels with impunity because they pose a threat to national security and they're labeled as terrorists. And the same playbook is happening in Iran. Moves are being put in place to justify an operation against the Iranian regime. Because once you designate the IRGC as terrorists, it gives you the legal and moral standing on which to go in and start decapitating that organization. And the IRGC, along with the Basij, are responsible for upholding the Iranian regime. The IRGC and the Basij falls, that's it. Game over for the Iranian regime. The problem is, what do you put in thereafter? The Shah's son, I'll tell you now, it's a joke. That man has absolutely no way of maintaining power. Even though he says he wants to come in as an interim government to form some sort of stability, it's not going to happen. The man doesn't have the charisma to unite the populace once the Iranian regime has collapsed. Furthermore, Iran has a diverse number of ethnicities. If you think that Iraq, after the American invasion, and Libya, after the Western intervention, remember David Cameron, Sarkozy flying all their jets, imposing no-fly zone over Libya, the killing of Muammar Gaddafi, and what has subsequently happened? Let's just say you can walk into Libya and buy a human being in a market stall as a slave. So that's where they are now. Now, if you think all that is bad, think again, because what's going to happen in Iran when that regime is removed is going to be far worse. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the regime needs to stay in power in order to keep peace and stability in the region. Far from it. I'm saying, what do you have as an alternative to counter that? And your options are one of two. Either put in this Shah's son, who to me, you get more charisma out of a plank of wood. Or alternatively, you find somebody within the Iranian regime that you can work with. Then it seems like a Venezuela situation where you're using the current regime to prop itself up. You need a real good PR firm to then justify why that should be the case. I think the escalation is there. I think the rhetoric is there. I think all the ducks are in a line for an American invasion. However, I know Trump has hinted that the Iranians are prepared to sit down and negotiate. I know the Iranians have said they're prepared to sit down and negotiate. However, the one striking red line that the Iranian minister has declared that they are not prepared to negotiate on is their military and their nuclear.
For Iran's foreign minister, the effort was clearly welcome, even though Iran says its defensive and missile capabilities are not up for negotiation.
Our nuclear efforts are peaceful in nature, so if these negotiations are maintained with mutual respect and trust, then we would be ready to engage in negotiations.
And this is precisely why the West wants to get, or the Americans and the West want to get involved in Iran. So it's similar to what's going on in Ukraine. You know, the Russians want the entire Donbass. The Ukrainians refuse to give up territory, yet they've now decided to sit down and have a negotiation. How that pans out, only God knows. I think Trump is waiting to see that the Russians and the Chinese will not get directly involved in Iran. Don't forget, China buys a lot of its oil from Iran. I think 90 or 98% of all Iranian oil ends up in China. The prices are favorable to the Chinese. Trump getting into Iran, destabilizing it, controlling the oil that flows out of there is a similar situation to Venezuela. He then controls the oil that goes out to China, and he is able to dictate terms to them. So I think, yes, while the Turks and the Americans are saying that a deal has been reached with the Kurds in Syria, you know, where the Syrian government has agreed to pull back forces, and the Kurds equally have agreed to pull back forces. You know, just skimming the agreement, I can tell you, I don't think it's something that is going to work. Because the current Syrian regime has come out of Al Qaeda and ISIS. And this is the perfect opportunity for them to have plausible deniability. What I'm saying is that the current Syrian regime was once allied with these people that are being released from prison in the Kurdish held areas. There is great enmity between them and the Kurds. Now, the Syrian government will say that yes, it is engaged in peace negotiations with the Kurds. However, they have a card up their sleeve, which is these ISIS members. They'll declare them as renegades. However, they'll use them to attack the Kurds. But at the same time, they have plausible deniability because they are in a position to say, we're sitting at the negotiating table. However, behind closed doors, they've got their minions acting on their behalf. Because the Kurds want an independent homeland. There is no way they're going to get that. The Iranians don't want to give it to them. The Iraqis don't want to give it to them. And neither do the Turks or the Syrians. So, in order for them to have lasting peace, they either need to give up the idea of a homeland, which I don't think they're going to do, or alternatively, they need to continue fighting. This in between doesn't make sense. Because as one group is going to say, okay, we've got peace, more radical factions within the Kurdish community will rise up and continue with this armed struggle. It's happened time and again all over the world. So I think that while things are really escalating in Iran, and this little glimmer of hope regarding the Iranian government willing to sit down, honestly, I don't think it's going to work. I think that all this is going to achieve is just a little bit more time. It's going to buy the Iranians a bit more time. But I think the inevitable is that there will be some sort of attack on Iran. And I think that the Iranian regime is now going to be in an existential battle for the survival of this regime. Thank you for spending time with us on this monologue, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.